All right, so this week our topic is environmental justice and wilderness. So we're going to look at how the idea of wilderness conservation intersects with environmental justice issues. And the photo you see there on the cover slide is of a British Army officer who is training African rangers in Kenya to protect against poachers in some of their national parks. And so we're going to be talking a little bit later about this kind of militarized strategy for protecting nature and some of the issues that can create. But first, to give our overview here, so first we're going to talk about the concept of wilderness conservation, how it became a major goal of the mainstream environmental movement. Then we're going to ask the question, does wilderness, as we conceive it, really even exist? Right? Where would we find something that qualifies as true wilderness? And then we're going to talk about the justice implications of trying to conserve that wilderness and the way that has been approached over the years. So when we start with the idea of wilderness as an agenda item for mainstream environmentalism, it's been one of the major things that environmentalists have worked on since the modern environmental movement started to emerge in the late 1800s. It's been a major thing that environmentalists have worked towards, the idea that there should be some areas that human settlement and exploitation and economic activity and stuff don't spread into. And so when you look at the writings of many of the major founding figures in the environmental movement, right, people like John Muir or Aldo Leopold, you'll see them talking a lot about wilderness and the importance of preserving these areas without human inhabitation. So it's been a major goal and has been a major accomplishment of the environmental movement, that many large areas have been preserved, starting with the national parks in the United States and eventually spreading through the world with a variety of different sorts of conservation areas that have been established. And the idea of wilderness in the United States really kind of came to a peak with the passage of the Wilderness Act in 1964 that enabled the federal government to set aside designated wilderness areas for conservation. And the Wilderness Act is also very famous for the definition that it gives of what wilderness is. So according to the Wilderness Act, it says, a wilderness, in contrast with those areas where man and his own works dominate the landscape, is hereby recognized as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. So this concept of wilderness is a concept of an area without substantial human involvement in the landscape, right, where people are visitors. So we may come there, go on a hike and camp there or something to experience the wilderness, but wilderness is basically doing its own thing without people really affecting what's going on. And that is usually cited as that's the value of wilderness, is that it is a non-human landscape. And you go to the wilderness to see a world that is outside of what humans are doing. It's not subject to human values or interference. That's kind of the value that is given for wilderness. And so with things like the Wilderness Act in the United States and similar legislation in lots of other countries, lots of areas have been set aside as wilderness. And the typical approach to conserving areas as wilderness, or similar sorts of areas with very limited human activity, is sometimes called fortress conservation. So the idea is you're going to pick out this area that's going to be your wilderness, and you're going to get rid of any people that might be in that area. You're going to exclude people and human activities from coming into that area, and you're going to put up kind of a hard border around it. So you're going to designate this area is our wilderness, and we're going to stop human activity from coming across that border, so that this area remains this protected pocket of land. So kind of metaphorically like putting up a fortress wall around this area to protect the nature that's inside of it from the damaging effects of human activity that would be trying to come in from outside. And so this model, which began with the national parks in the United States, has been exported around the world. So this is really a US idea in its initial conception, but has now been popularized in the whole rest of the world. Just about every country has established national parks and similar sorts of conservation areas, usually on this fortress conservation model, where we're going to designate this area to keep human activity out of in order to protect the nature that exists within it. So if we're going to try to protect wilderness, we have to ask the question, where do we find wilderness to protect? You know, the ideal of wilderness is an area that has never been impacted by human activity, right? That has existed according to natural phenomena, natural processes and laws, without human interruption, without human degradation since time immemorial. And if we have a really demanding definition of wilderness like that, there's not much wilderness in the world. So this map is sort of one way of thinking about this issue. You may have seen this map. It goes around a lot on social media around Columbus Day every year as part of the kind of rebuttal to the idea that Columbus discovered America, right? Because, of course, when Columbus arrived in America, there had been people living here for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So he was not the first to discover this part of the world. And in fact, there are very few parts of the world that were truly discovered for the first time by Europeans during the so-called age of discovery or age of exploration. So the vast majority of the world that Europeans learned of for the first time during that era was inhabited. You know, there were people living there, using that land, knowing about that land. So what you see marked out in color on this map are the areas that had truly been uninhabited by people up until, you know, about 1492 or so. And you'll see that it is basically tiny islands in the remote parts of the ocean, right? So you've got, you know, the Azores Islands, the Galapagos Islands, Falkland Islands, Tristan da Cunha, some of these, you know, really remote small islands were kind of the only things that really nobody had ever been to prior to that point in history. The only sort of big landmass that you see there is, of course, Antarctica. So that means that the remaining areas here had been inhabited by people, and so therefore it's questionable whether any of those areas would be this kind of pure, never touched wilderness. So in those areas that have been inhabited by people, there's a whole range of uses of the land by the indigenous people there. And so on the one hand, you have uses that might be highly transformative of the physical landscape. So something like farming. You know, if you're farming the land, you clear the trees off and all that stuff, that's a major physical transformation of the land. So that's kind of on one end of the scale. Then through to the other end of the scale, you have uses of that land that didn't make a big physical impact on the land, even though they were very culturally important. So that would be things like ceremonial uses of land. There might be a sacred mountain, for example, and there'd be, you know, maybe a trail up there and a small altar when people would go to conduct ceremonies there, but there wouldn't be necessarily a big physical transformation of that landscape. So there's a range of levels of human impact on the landscape and on the ecosystems in those areas that were inhabited by people for long periods of time. Then activities like the use of fire and hunting can have significant landscape level impacts. So even if people aren't visiting every spot on the landscape, their use of fire and their hunting practices can have broad scale impacts. So it's very common in most parts of the world for the native people of that area to deliberately light fires in certain times during the year to encourage the growth of certain desirable plants, to attract animals, to hunt, to reduce the hazard from a wildfire that would get out of control, etc. And so with fire, you can affect a very broad landscape. And so there are lots of areas. So, for example, here in Pennsylvania, the use of fire by indigenous people tended to maintain a more open understory to the forest. So the forests of this area were often not as dense with undergrowth as they are sometimes today because we've stopped using fire in that way. And so by clearing out a lot of the understory that made travel easier in this area, it encouraged things like blueberries that are plants that respond well to fire. And so forth. So it was a modification of that landscape that sometimes was not apparent to early European visitors that came into the area if they didn't like see people there burning it, but had this sort of landscape level change. And then hunting can do similar things. So if you are hunting a certain species, right, that's going to have an effect on the population of that species, and then other effects on the species that your game would have eaten, or other predators that would have eaten it, and so forth. So if you add this additional predation from humans into the mix, that's going to alter things as compared to what they would have been without that human hunting going on. So there can be these less apparent human impacts that extend across broader landscapes. And so it's important then to not jump to the conclusion that all human impacts on ecosystems are harmful or bad things. So this is a sort of underlying assumption that we often take for granted when we look at how humans are affecting the natural landscapes around us. We assume that human impact is necessarily a bad thing, and the ideal would be to remove all human impact. And that's kind of the idea behind wilderness, is that these areas are the best thing for these areas is to have no human impact, because human impact is going to be damaging or destructive. But if you have human communities that have lived in an area for a very long time, those human activities are part of the functioning of that ecosystem. And so just like taking out any other species would be potentially damaging to that ecosystem, right? We don't say that, well, the wilderness would be better off if we eliminated all rabbits from it. If there's an area that rabbits naturally live, right, they're not an invasive species, right, that would seem silly, and in fact probably harmful to that ecosystem if we were to take an entire species and just eliminate it. So we might apply the same kind of thinking to humans, that eliminating humans from an area could also be harmful to that if human activity is part of how those ecosystems have historically been functioning. So human activity can be a component of the ecosystem. And I think this idea is captured well by an expression that's used by a lot of Aboriginal people in Australia to describe their activities in the landscape, especially things like fire and hunting. They describe it as caring for country. So they see it as a duty that the people of an area have to continue to interact with the landscape in these ways, to continue to, for example, practice these traditional burning practices where fires are being deliberately lit in certain places at certain times during the year. And it is bad for the environment for those practices to be lost and for people to cease to do those things, that it's important to care for that country by continuing to engage with it, continuing to fill a certain role in the ecosystem. And so, of course, none of this is meant to say that all human impacts on the environment and natural landscapes are good ones. Obviously, there's plenty of destructive, negative things that we can do. It's just to say that we shouldn't assume that all human activity in the impacts nature is necessarily a negative thing or harmful. So, if all of these areas have had human inhabitation for such a long time, where do we get the idea that we could have wilderness in the first place? Well, one of the places that this idea comes from is the fact that a lot of these areas became depopulated during the process of European colonialism. And so they appeared to be uninhabited wildernesses. So as Europeans moved into areas like the Americas, they brought with them diseases that had major negative effects on indigenous populations that hadn't evolved any resistance to these diseases. So you would sometimes have up to 90 or 95% of certain nations dying from epidemics of things like smallpox, measles, influenza, and so forth that were being brought by Europeans. And then on top of that, you have the negative effects arising from direct military conflicts, where Europeans are deliberately driving people out, the economic disruptions that are caused by chunks of land being taken away by European settlers or by certain species that were important to indigenous economies being hunted to or nearly to extinction. So all of these things cause this drastic decrease in indigenous populations in many areas of the Americas. And if there was sort of a gap between when that population crash hit and when significant numbers of European settlers started to actually come into that area and settle down, they could get the impression that this was a uninhabited wilderness since time immemorial. And one of the most striking examples of this is in the Amazon rainforest. So that was an area that was actually very densely populated. Large portions of the Amazon were turned into farms by the indigenous people of that region. But huge numbers of them died as a result of European diseases and other impacts. And then by the time Europeans started to actually enter into the deeper parts of the Amazon, those areas that had been farms had regrown into a dense rainforest. And the Europeans assumed that this rainforest had been there forever, had existed since time immemorial, because they saw hardly any people there. And the ones that they saw were living as hunters and gatherers, not as farmers. And it's only much more recently that archaeologists have started to document just the enormous scale of human inhabitation and modification of the landscape prior to the arrival of Europeans, and have actually shown that some of the richest soils in the Amazon, the ones where the rainforest grows most intensively, these really dark soils along the rivers, were actually created by human activity. That the farming practices of the Amazonian peoples actually enriched the soil and made it more fertile, because tropical soils in their sort of natural state are often very poor soils. They have very little nutrients and stuff, but human farming practices enriched these soils and helped make this profuse growth of the rainforest possible. But because of the loss of population, it was assumed by Europeans that this area was a wilderness without people. So if you've got people living in areas and you want to create a wilderness preserve of some sort, then you have to take the land away from the people that live there. So we have this process that we can call conservation by dispossession. We're taking land away from people for conservation. So dispossession is your unjust taking of land from a group or a nation. So we are going to remove the people here, take their land away, so that it can be used to create a wilderness area or conservation area. And so there are plenty of historical examples of local people that were living in an area being ejected, being forcibly removed from an area in order to turn it into a conservation area that has no human population in it. So I've got three examples there that I'm going to touch on just to illustrate this concept, but you can find this in the history of so many different national parks and wilderness areas and so forth. So if we look at Yellowstone National Park, right, the iconic conservation area, prior to white settlers coming into the area, there were about half a dozen different tribes that lived in the Yellowstone area and made use of the area that now constitutes Yellowstone National Park for hunting, for gathering, for fishing, for ceremonial purposes, and a whole bunch of different kinds of things. By the time that the park was officially established, and the time it became Yellowstone National Park, the only inhabitants that were left that were actually living within the park boundaries were a group of Shoshone. And so they were forcibly ejected by the U.S. government so that we could have this park without human inhabitation in it. So they sent in the army and kicked the indigenous people out to create this national park. You had a similar thing happening in Africa. So a lot of African countries, either during the colonial era or post-colonial, created national parks on this U.S. model, and that often involved ejecting the indigenous people that had lived in that area. So one very famous example is Serengeti National Park in Tanzania. That's one of the most famous nature areas in Africa. It gets tons of tourists coming there to see the wildebeest migrations and these kinds of things. That area had traditionally been inhabited by the Maasai people. So they are a group that traditionally lived mainly by cattle herding. So they had these big herds of cattle, and they would move around the landscape, between different watering holes and grazing areas and so forth. So they lived in this Serengeti area. In fact, the word Serengeti comes from Maasai language. But in order to create this as this nature park where you go to see animals, the Maasai people were ejected from that area. They were forced out of the Serengeti. They were also forced out of several other conservation areas in that sort of region of Central East Africa where they lived. So you have this again, forcible dispossession of a group that had been living there for a long time in order to create this human-free conservation area. Then the third example that I've got listed there is Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. So Shenandoah is a more recently established national park in the mid-20th century, and the indigenous people of that area had been expelled from it long before the idea to make it into a national park came along. So this had been groups like, I believe, the Shawnee, the Cherokee, and a few other groups had lived in the Shenandoah area. They had been pushed out in order to make room for white settlement long before the national park came along. But then when the national park was set up, there were these white people living there. They were typically very poor, right? This is an area of Appalachia, but they were also ejected despite having lived there for quite a few generations in order to create a national park where there's no people living in the park. So lots of different local populations in different areas have been pushed out in order to create conservation areas and national parks and so forth. So this is creating wilderness by removing people from it rather than simply protecting wilderness that had existed without human impact for a long time. So when these people are removed from conservation areas, they're typically resettled onto a less desirable land. And so the case of the Maasai is particularly ironic because these are people that live by cattle herding, so they need areas to graze and water their cattle. When they were pushed out of places like the Serengeti, they were pushed into areas that were less suitable for their cattle, areas that were, for example, drier, so there was less grass growing, there were fewer watering holes and so forth, and just less total land. So they're being compressed into a smaller area of land. And so when you get these additional people with all their herds of cattle and stuff compressed into these smaller areas of land, you're going to get problems with overgrazing. You're pushing too many people into too little land that is not suitable for the way of life that those people are living. And then that degradation of the environment and the problems that were created by that then were blamed on the Maasai. So they were accused of being bad stewards of their environment, and that was then used to further justify kicking them out of national parks. So the people that ran the parks said, hey, clearly the Maasai are destroying the land that they're on right now, so that's why we can't let them into the park, even though the reason they're destroying the land they're on is because they weren't allowed into the park, where there were better grazing lands and more watering holes and so forth for their cattle. And so this is a thing you often see in environmental justice issues, is the people who are the victims of the injustice getting blamed for their own situation by the people that created the problem in the first place. So we have this expulsion of the local people from conservation areas, but in some cases, people aren't wholly expelled from conservation areas. They may be allowed to remain in certain portions of that conservation area. There are sort of designated village regions and stuff set up within the park, with the idea that these local people are going to themselves be a tourist attraction. So you come to the park to see, the wildlife, and you also come to see these indigenous people living their traditional way of life. And so that ends up creating this commodification of this traditional way of life. So people are practicing these traditional practices not because this actually supports their livelihood anymore, especially if they're restricted to small areas of the park, but as a kind of show entertainment for tourists to see people wearing these traditional clothing and see people, cooking traditional foods and living in traditional huts and this kind of thing. So it commodifies this this presentation of this traditional way of life as a attraction in the park. So that's the sort of the alternative to being ejected entirely from the park is often this commodification of your way of life as a tourist attraction. So those are some impacts on the people that actually live within the area designated as the park conservation area. But there are also impacts that extend beyond the fence line, that go past the area that's directly occupied by the park, because you'll have lots of people living in the area just outside of your conservation zone. So when a park like this is set up, there are often a lot of big promises made about the economic benefits of tourism. That we're going to create this park and it's going to draw in all these tourists and they're going to spend a whole bunch of money. They're going to need hospitality. They're going to need food. They're not going to need guides, etc. And so this is going to bring a whole bunch of money into the area and boost the economies of the neighboring communities. The research that's been done on this to document whether these promises pan out has shown mixed results at best. Sometimes neighboring communities do benefit. In many cases, they don't benefit, or they don't benefit as much as was promised, or enough to fully compensate them from what they've lost by the establishment of this park. And often when there is economic growth associated with these tourist enterprises and stuff, a lot of times the profits from that get monopolized by powerful actors or outside institutions. So, if you can imagine, you've got a new national park and they open a Holiday Inn next to it. The profits that are made by that Holiday Inn, a big chunk of those is going back to wherever Holiday Inn headquarters is, right? And then out to the investors that own that company. It's not staying in those local communities. The local people that might, work as the housekeeping staff at that Holiday Inn are going to get then only a fraction of the tourist dollars that are spent by visitors. And so that's a very common thing, because often these outside companies and stuff are the ones that have the most access to hook up with potential customers. You're planning a trip to a certain area, and you're Googling for guides that could take you around and stuff. You're going to probably find the larger operations that have a nicer website and so forth, rather than local people who are trying to work in this business for themselves. So the economic promises that are often made often don't pan out in the way that that local people were promised. You also then have a loss of access to economic activities that used to be conducted within the conservation area. So even if you didn't live within the park boundaries, even if your village wasn't actually in there, you may have accessed that land for a variety of things, such as hunting, grazing your animals, gathering various food and medicinal products, and so forth. And so often a park will be set up in an area that has no villages or anything in it, with the assumption that this is wilderness land, that this is land that nobody is using. But in fact, local people use it quite extensively. And so then that means that those people either lose access entirely to those things that they used to get from the now conservation area, or they end up having to deal with the guards of this conservation area and get harassed by them when you go in and try to gather some medicinal plants anyway, and risk getting caught and harassed by the guards, or you have to pay bribes to them. Because these guards are often members of the local community, and they understand the people's need to go into these areas, but they also see an opportunity to personally profit, because their salary as a guard is often very low, and so they'll take bribes or show favoritism towards certain people within the local community based on various local politics and so forth. So that can have a big negative impact on the livelihoods of people living in neighboring areas. You also have the problem of injuries to people and property damage. So that includes damage to homes, and especially damage to agricultural areas by animals that live in the conservation area, but they don't understand the idea of a border on a conservation area, so they'll wander out of that area and hurt people, destroy things. So elephants, for example, are a big problem in Africa and India. So a lot of conservation areas are set up specifically to conserve elephants, because they're an endangered species. They're also a very charismatic species that lots of tourists are going to want to come and see. So they conserve areas that are prime elephant habitat, and by removing people from the conservation area, the elephant population grows. But then those elephants wander out of the conservation area, and they smash somebody's house, or they trample somebody's fields, or eat all of the crops in your field. And it's hard to build a fence that's really going to contain an elephant, especially if you have to fence in your entire giant conservation area. So they'll wander out and do a lot of damage to people in neighboring communities. And because these animals are an endangered species, they're the thing that tourists are being drawn in to see. It's typically illegal for the local people to kill them or injure them in order to protect their property and even in some cases their lives. So an elephant's rampaging in your field, you might want to go out and shoot it to stop it, but you can't do that because they're a protected species, and it's kind of hard to hide the fact that you've killed an elephant. So this causes a lot of livelihood losses to people. Many parks have some sort of a compensation scheme where you can file for kind of an insurance payment essentially if animals from the park damage your property, but that's a lot of paperwork, and the payments that you get are often very small, and people get rejected all the time. So it's not really, in most cases, adequate to compensate for the losses that people might suffer in scenarios like that. And then another issue, and this brings us back to the picture that we saw at the very beginning of this lesson, is militarized enforcement of anti-poaching laws. So poaching is a problem in many of these areas. The species that are endangered are often in high demand on the black market for things like, rhinoceros horn, elephant tusks, and so forth. And so there are poachers going after these animals in these conservation areas. And one response that has been implemented in a lot of different areas is to heavily militarize enforcement. So you create these paramilitary squads with high-powered weapons and military equipment to go out and hunt down and stop poachers. And a lot of these things have gotten a lot of media attention around the world. And there's a lot of sort of, positive framing of this, right? Of we're going to take down the bad guys and stop these horrible poachers that are killing these beautiful animals that are endangered species. And a lot of money has gone into this militarized approach to poaching enforcement. But it can raise a lot of environmental justice issues. First off, these are groups that are treating this as a military operation, not as a law enforcement or police operation. So if they see someone they think is a poacher, they may just gun that person down on site and just stop them because, hey, the equipment I've been given is this, machine gun. So I'm just going to shoot this person. So there is no system of, due process of, having a fair trial for someone, of choosing a punishment that is appropriate to the crime that was committed. It's just we're just gonna kill this person to stop them. So they're assumed to be an enemy combatant rather than a person engaged in a crime. And because there's not this due process, then that means that people who are not engaging in poaching may be threatened or even killed by anti-poaching groups because they're not taking the time. They're not doing an investigation. The person doesn't have a chance to make their case. They're just based on the assumptions of the anti-poachers are taken down, and they apply the same approach to someone who is killing one rhinoceros as someone who has killed 100 rhinoceroses. There can be harassment of local communities if the anti-poaching squads think that local communities are, hiding or protecting known poachers, and so they can, use their military power to harass local communities in various ways. And this also focuses a lot on the lowest level people in the poaching world. So a lot of the goods that are being obtained by poaching are being sold on an international market. Right? So rhinoceros horn is in demand in Asia, while the rhinoceroses are being killed in Africa. So it's this international scheme, and you have these large-scale, criminal enterprises that are coordinating and organizing this whole thing. But these militarized anti-poaching squads are going after the lowest level people, the people that actually, go out and shoot the rhinoceros or whatever. And so they're not getting at this, international enterprise that is organizing this system, that is getting the vast majority of the profits, because the local people that actually do the shooting are often not making very much money off of this, but they don't have a lot of other options. So it's not addressing the larger organizations. It's not addressing the demand that's driving this whole system. It's not addressing the conditions of poverty that lead a lot of people to work for poaching operations. And so, you kill one person, they're going to find someone else to hire because you've got lots of, economically desperate people in the area. So there are a lot of problems with this militarized approach to poaching enforcement and maintaining this fortress of fortress conservation. So, to wrap up, I want to come back to an idea that we discussed a few lessons ago about co-management. And I brought this up as one approach or one way of interaction between indigenous people and non-indigenous land management authorities. So this is something that is often proposed as an alternative to this fortress conservation, an alternative to this idea that we're going to kick all the people out and put guards around it to protect nature within this wilderness area. So there is an increasing use of co-management approaches around the world as more and more people are recognizing some of the justice issues that are raised by the fortress conservation model. So there's increasing interest in co-management. And so I've listed there sort of the flagship examples of co-management are in Australia, the Uluru-Kata National Park in central Australia and Kakadu National Park in the Northern Territory of Australia. So these are parks where the indigenous people of the area and the Australian government work together to determine the way that those lands are going to be managed, to decide on things like allowing hunting, burning, fire practices in the area, tourism levels, and so forth. And I think I've touched on these a little bit in that last one. So I gave the example, I think, of at Uluru. You can walk on this path around the base of the rock that is designed to steer you away from certain areas that are sacred sites to the Anangu people that live in that area because they don't want tourists interfering in the sacred sites, even if those are areas that the tourists might think are real cool to look at. So they've designed it to protect the religious practices of the indigenous people. So co-management sounds like a really good idea, and if you can do it right, it can be a really productive way of ensuring that the local people are not harmed by conservation of nature. However, in practice, there are a lot of pitfalls that co-management can fall into. So it's often done on the dominant society's terms. So it's not a true equal partnership between the various entities involved. It's often a system that's set up by the dominant society that then local or indigenous people are invited into in certain limited kinds of ways. It also often demands that indigenous people justify their sovereignty over an area on environmental grounds. So rather than saying that, we, the indigenous people of this area, should have the final say over how this land is managed because this is our land and has been since long before anybody else came around, they have to justify it by saying, we, the indigenous people of this area, should get a say in how the land is managed because we're good environmentalists and our culture will protect the environment. So the protection of environment ends up taking precedence over claims to political sovereignty by indigenous people. And so then that means that then there's always the risk that their role in managing this land could be questioned or taken away by the dominant society if they are judged to not be good enough environmentalists. If your claim is resting on the idea that you're a good environmentalist that can take care of the land from an ecological point of view, that's a less solid foundation than saying, our sovereignty rests on the fact that we're the people of this land and have always been here. And so that can lead to a phenomenon that's called ecoincarceration, where local people are essentially trapped by the expectations that the larger society has of them continuing to live this environmentally friendly lifestyle. So possibilities for development, possibilities for social change, possibilities for economic growth are limited because there's this expectation that you are going to live in this environmentally friendly way and that you are going to essentially perform this kind of environmental lifestyle in order to justify being able to continue to live in this area and maintain some sort of authority over your land. And then the last point that I'll make about potential pitfall of co-management that goes back to the underlying premise of a lot of this wilderness conservation is the question of a site-specific versus a landscape-level approach to conservation. So if you are creating a wilderness area park, the idea is you've picked out a specific site, right? This area is going to be our conservation area, where protection of nature is going to happen within this area, and then it's not going to happen outside of that. Right? We've set aside an area, we've separated environmental conservation from everything else we're doing with the land, and so this area is where the conservation is happening, and that area is not where it's happening. So that's a site-specific kind of approach, and co-management is usually implemented within a site-specific approach. Right? We've got Uluru-Katajuta Park that's set aside from all of the lands around it that are used for things like cattle ranching and mining, and we're going to conserve nature within the boundaries of this site. But ecosystems don't obey our lines that we draw on a map, and things that are happening in that broader landscape will end up having impacts on what happens within your designated conservation area. And the way of life of the local people who are being impacted by the creation of a wilderness area or park weren't limited to just that area. They lived across the entire connected landscape. And so effective management needs to look at that entire landscape, look at how those ecosystems are connected into that broader area. And so as an example of this, to kind of wrap up our discussion here, if we're looking at the issue of cultural fire, so there's been a lot of interest since the Black Summer fires in Australia and then the major fires last year in California. There's been a lot more interest among non-Indigenous people in reviving indigenous fire practices. And so the term cultural fire is sometimes used to describe these fire practices. So the way that the indigenous people would use prescribed burning on the landscape to manage the ecosystems and reduce the risk of catastrophic fires. There's increasing talk about that, increasing desire to bring that kind of cultural fire back. But one of the things that's important to understand, if we're going to effectively bring back cultural fire, is that was something that was done at the whole landscape scale. That wasn't something that you could do just in a limited area. And so when indigenous people would burn their landscape, they would range across the entire set of interconnected ecosystems in the area where they lived. So you can't implement it just on a highly localized basis. That has to incorporate all the different sorts of land, both conservation lands and lands that are being used for various economic purposes, and lands where people are living and so forth, all have to be tied together to effectively reintroduce those kinds of practices that had been suppressed by the dominant institutions for a long time. So I will end there, and I will see you in our class sessions.